June 24th, 1993. A computer science professor at Yale walks into his office and opens a package. There's a bomb inside the package. The bomb goes off, destroys the man's right hand, shatters his right eye, and by the time he reaches the hospital, his blood pressure is at 0. This video is about that man, the man who sent that bomb while living in a cabin in Montana with no electricity, no running water, and for 17 years, the FBI could not find him. His name was Ted Kaczynski, and the story that you might know about him is about 10% of what actually happened. Because before he was the Unabomber, and before the cabin, and before the bombs, and before the Manifesto, Ted Kaczynski was a 16-year-old kid who got into Harvard on a scholarship. And what happened to him there is something that Harvard has worked pretty hard to try and cover up, pretty much. Also, that Yale professor, the one who lost his hand at the top of this video for opening that package in 1993, 33 years later, today, well, a couple weeks ago, he was suspended from Yale for emailing a convicted sex offender about young women. That is Jeffrey Epstein. The world's a small place. Ted Kaczynski was born on May 22, 1942 in Chicago to a working-class Polish-American family. His father made sausages, one of 3 jobs available to the Polish during the 1940s. His mother, Wanda, was sharp, well-read, and she poured everything she had into making sure her kids were educated. By all accounts, Ted was a normal baby, happy, laughing, goo-goo, gagaing, etc., engaged with the world around him. And then something happened that his family would talk about for the rest of their lives. When Ted was about 9 months old, he had a severe allergic reaction and was hospitalized for several days. And at this time, the hospital wouldn't let his parents visit. That was the official policy. At the time, the parents were not allowed in. And his mother described what came back to her as a different child. Before the hospital, Ted was a laughing, active baby, and after the hospital, he had completely shut down. He stopped smiling, stopped making eye contact, and it took weeks for his parents to get him to trust them again. Now, a lot of people will hear that and think that that's a very small thing, a baby in a hospital for a few days, but attachment researchers will tell you that separation trauma at that extremely young age can fundamentally rewire how a child relates to other people for the rest of their life. And when you look at the next chapters in Ted Kaczynski's life, it's kind of hard not to keep that in mind and think about, what happened at the hospital in that event. Ted grew up in Evergreen Park, Illinois, which is a suburb south of Chicago, and from the beginning, 2 things were obvious. He was extraordinarily intelligent, and he was extraordinarily alone. Ted's IQ tested at 167 points, which, to put that in context, is higher than Einstein's estimated IQ and as high as Ivan Drago's from Rocky IV. All right, Dolph Lundgren. Very high IQ. Whatever that means. His parents even had him skip 6th grade, and then they had him skip 11th grade, which meant that by the time he was in a classroom with other kids, he was always 2 years younger than basically everyone around him. He later described himself as, quote, a social cripple, and he blamed his parents for what he called destroying his life by advancing him those 2 grades. A lot of people, when they hear or tell the Ted Kaczynski story, start with Harvard or the cabin or, the bombs. It's important to note that he saw himself as a social cripple or a social outcast. Ted's brother David, born in 1949, would later describe Ted as someone who was brilliant but had trouble connecting to the people around him, which that's starting to track. By the way, I skipped 2 grades and graduated high school when I was 15. I think the main difference between me and Ted Kaczynski is that I am stupid. That's the big thing. My IQ is, let's see, what's room temperature? Yeah, 78. Big main difference, really. The family spent time together on camping trips, canoe trips, classic 50s and 60s shit, and David looked up to his older brother. But even within his own family, Ted was always somewhere else. In 1958, at the age of 15, Ted Kaczynski was accepted to Harvard. He showed up on campus at age 16 on a full scholarship, a child from a sausage maker's family in Chicago walking into one of the most prestigious universities on the planet, and he was 2 years younger than every other freshman. And during his sophomore year, a psychology professor named Henry Murray recruited him for a study. Ted was 17 years old, and what happened during that study is something that Harvard sealed in a vault in the year 2000 and has never since opened it. Obviously, for the sake of exposition, to fully understand what happened to Mr. Kaczynski at Harvard, we have to understand the man who did it to him. Henry Murray was a Harvard psychology professor, which would be like calling J. Robert Oppenheimer a physicist. Sure, it's true, but it's kind of like beside the point a bit. you know? Before Harvard, Murray spent World War II as a lieutenant colonel for the OSS, which is the direct predecessor to the CIA. His job was selecting and training spies. He designed psychological stress tests to figure out which recruits could handle interrogation, deception, and extreme pressure without breaking. He developed methods for interrogating POWs, prisoners of war. He profiled Adolf Hitler for the US government and wrote an entire psychological breakdown of how Hitler's mind actually worked. And then the war ended, and Henry Murray went back to Harvard. But clearly, he did not stop experimenting. In 1959, Murray launched a study with an official title designed to sound as boring as possible. He called it Multiform Assessments of Personality Development Among Gifted College Men. This test turned out to be a sort of Enneagram test for domestic terrorists, it seems like. Kind of slightly different. 22 Harvard undergrads were recruited, and Ted Kaczynski at 17 was one of them, and his assigned code name was Lawful, which is an interesting code name. Students were told that they'd be participating in a debate about personal philosophy. They were asked to write detailed essays about their most deeply held beliefs, their worldviews, their aspirations, and, according to multiple sources, their sexual desires and erotic fantasies. They were told that in a day or two they'd sit down with a fellow student and debate the merits of their individual philosophies. But unfortunately, that is not what happened. Instead, each student was brought into a room one at a time with bright lights aimed at their faces, electrodes strapped to their bodies, their heart rates and other biometrics measured, like their blood pressure and their galvanic skin response. Then, in the room, they were filmed through a one-way mirror. There were obviously cameras behind that mirror rolling. And instead of a fellow student, they were facing a law student who had been given what Murray called a psychological battle plan. And this law student had read the most personal things these kids had ever written down, and this law student's job was to use that material to psychologically destroy them. Murray described the methodology himself. His own words were, "The attacks were vehement, sweeping, and personally abusive." The intent, in Murray's own framing, was to catch the student by surprise or to deceive them, bring them to anger, ridicule their beliefs, and brutalize them. And then, after the session was over, Murray made the students sit down and watch the filmed footage of their own humiliation. Ted Kaczynski went through this for 3 years with over 200 hours of sessions from the time he was 17 years old until he graduated in 1962. His brother David would later say that every week for 3 years, someone met with him to verbally abuse and humiliate him. But it's important to note, Ted himself was dismissive about it. He said the experiments had, quote, no significant effect on the course of his life. He claimed there was only one unpleasant experience that lasted about 30 minutes. But that's pretty confusing and doesn't really seem to track because in 1962, the same year that Murray ended the study, Kaczynski wrote in his personal notes that he, quote, became hostile towards technology. So that, among other subjects from the study, reported being haunted by the experience for more than 25 years. So it's possible that this had a lasting effect. Now, the big open question with a seemingly obvious answer is, was this directly connected to the CIA? I don't know. We don't know. That's not for sure. And that would certainly be by design. MKUltra, which you've surely heard of, was a real CIA program authorized in 1953 by CIA Director Allen Dulles. It was run by a chemist named Sidney. And MKUltra had 149 sub-projects spread across more than 80 universities and institutions. So it seems plausible that this could have been one of them. For example, they dosed people with LSD without their knowledge, they ran sensory deprivation experiments, and they tested psychological torture techniques on unwitting American citizens. One of their own scientists, Frank Olson, was secretly given LSD and 9 days later fell from a 13th-story hotel window. The government obviously called it a suicide, but his family got an apology from Gerald Ford and a $750,000 settlement. So I don't know if that's, how suicides work. But in 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of all MKUltra files. His explanation under oath was, quote, since the program was over and finished and done with, we thought we would just get rid of all the files as well so that anybody who assisted us in the past would not be subject to follow-up questions or embarrassment, if you will. Protecting them from embarrassment. That makes sense. The government loves protecting people from embarrassment. So the records that could tell us whether or not Murray's Harvard study was an MKUltra sub-project were conveniently destroyed. on purpose to prevent embarrassment. Now, there are some things that we do know. We do know that Murray had a direct background in the CIA and OSS. His methodology aligned almost perfectly with MKUltra's documented objectives. Multiple sources report his study was funded by the CIA, the Pentagon, and the Rockefeller Foundation. And Harvard, in 2000, when journalists started asking questions, did not open the records and instead sealed them permanently to prevent embarrassment. That's my guess. Comment down below what your guess is. Whether or not the CIA was directly signing the checks, a 17-year-old kid at Harvard was subjected to years of psychological abuse by a former intelligence officer using interrogation techniques developed for enemy combatants. And then he ended up sending bombs in the mail to kill people. So that happened, that's documented, and then Harvard sealed the file permanently. Rachel Corbett, who published a book about this in October of 2025 called The Monsters We Make, actually got her hands on a transcript from one of Kaczynski's sessions, and in it, the interrogator called his thinking insipid and asinine. Slight side tangent, that same Harvard, the one that did this to a 17-year-old kid in 1959, would later accept $9.1 million from Jeffrey Epstein and give him a private office on campus because, you know, it's all about academia and learning and stuff, right? Same institution. Predator, you know, it's really, it's kind of a moot point, but it's really important to continuously remember that these are all like the same sort of people in the same kind of class. That's what we're talking about. After Harvard, Ted Kaczynski did what brilliant people are supposed to do. They graduate school. He entered the University of Michigan in 1962 and specialized in a branch of mathematics called geometric function theory, which is so confusing and abstract that his doctoral advisor, Alan Shields, called Ted's dissertation the best I have ever directed. By the way, I looked into this shit and it is really confusing. It'd be like trying to think about it. How would I think about this stuff? It'd be like using math to create functions that explain how mirrors warp your reflection. Kind of, maybe. I don't know. I think it's used in video games and like the machine language programming for graphics. Another committee member, Maxwell Reed, said he guessed maybe 10 or 12 people in the entire country could understand or appreciate that dissertation. The dissertation was called Boundary Functions, and it was a 100-page handwritten proof of a problem that had gone unsolved, and it won the Summer B. Myers Prize for the best math dissertation at Michigan that year. That's insane. Dude is really smart. So in 1967, at the age of 25 years old, Ted Kaczynski became an assistant professor at UC Berkeley. He was the youngest professor the university had ever hired, a 25-year-old professor. And on paper, everything was working perfectly for Ted. Ivy League degree, prestigious PhD, tenure-track position at one of the best universities in the country, all before he's 26 years old. But something was wrong! Obviously, something was very wrong, and the people around him could feel it, even if they couldn't name it. His colleagues at Berkeley would later say that they remembered almost nothing about him. He taught his classes, he showed up, he went home, he had no friendships, no mentors, no after-work drinks, no faculty dinners. He was a ghost who taught calculus, essentially. And then on June 30th, 1969, without any explanation, Ted Kaczynski resigned. The department chairman, John Addison, wrote to Ted's doctoral advisor and described the resignation as, quote, quite out of the blue. Nobody knew why Ted resigned. Ted never explained it. He just did. He just quit. He moved back to his parents' house in Lombard, Illinois at age 27 and lived in his childhood bedroom. He stayed there for 2 years, doing essentially nothing. And then in 1971, he moved to a piece of land outside Lincoln, Montana, and built a cabin with his own hands. 10 foot by 12 foot, a loft for sleeping, no electricity, no running water. He grew vegetables, hunted wabbits, and taught himself to live entirely off the land. He later wrote, quote, I hate the system not because of some abstract humanitarian principle, but because I hated living in the system. I got out of it by getting into the mountains, but the system still would not let me alone. But after a few years, it seemed to work. He was alone and he was free, and he was as far away from Harvard and Berkeley and all of it as a person could get. But then the logging started. The wilderness around his cabin, the one thing he'd chosen over everything else, started being torn apart. Roads were cut through forests he'd walked for years. Trees he'd known were gone overnight. And something building within this person that had been building for a very long time, potentially even since the allergic reaction as a baby, since the classrooms where he never fit in, since whatever Murray did to him at Harvard, since whatever made him walk away from a career that most smart people would kill for, that thing finally found a direction. And on May 25th, 1978, a package appeared in a parking lot at Northwestern University. That was the first bomb from the Unabomber. The first bomb was addressed to a materials engineering professor at Northwestern named Buckley Christ, but the package was found in a parking lot at the University of Illinois in Chicago with Christ's return address on it. It was sent back to Northwestern where a campus police officer named Terry Marker opened it and it detonated. It caused minor injuries, nobody died. It was a clumsy, amateurish bomb, but it was the beginning of the career of the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski. A year later, there was another bomb at Northwestern. A graduate student named John Harris picked up what looked like a present left in a common room. It exploded, and once again, there were minor injuries. And then Ted Kaczynski did something that changed the scale of what he was doing entirely. On November 15th, 1979, he put a bomb in the cargo hold of American Airlines Flight 444 flying from Chicago to Washington, D.C. The bomb detonated mid-flight, smoke filled the cabin, and the plane had to make an emergency landing. 12 passengers were treated for smoke inhalation, but nobody died. If that bomb had fully worked the way it was designed to, the plane would have most likely gone down. And that's when the FBI really started looking for this guy who's just mailing bombs. The FBI created the Unabomber Task Force, the University and Airline Bomber Task Force. The media shortened it to the Unabomber, and the name struck. And over the next several years, the bombs kept coming, and they kept getting more and more sophisticated. In June of 1980, he mailed a hollowed-out book to Percy Wood, the president of United Airlines. Wood opened it at his home in Lake Forest, Illinois, and the explosion caused severe injuries, partial blindness, and hearing loss. The book was published by Arbor House, whose logo was a tree, and the victim's last name was Wood. Ted really liked trees, it seemed. Ted then hit UC Berkeley twice, which was the university where he used to teach. In 1982, an engineering professor named, this is his real name, Diogenes Angelakos, picked up what looked like a tool left in a break room in Corey Hall, and it blew up in his face. 3 years later, in the exact same building, an Air Force captain named John Hauser, who was there as a graduate student, opened a package in the computer lab and lost 4 fingers and the vision in one of his eyes. Hauser wanted to be an astronaut, and Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, ruined that dream. In November of 1985, Ted sent a bomb to a psychology professor at the University of Michigan named James McConnell. McConnell's specialty was behavior modification, and he wrote a textbook called Understanding Human Behavior and published extensively on techniques for changing how people think and act. So a man who had been subjected to psychological experiments at Harvard sent a bomb to a psychologist who wrote about behavior modification. Now, we mentioned the logging earlier. The journaling was a big part of Ted's modus operandi. He was writing all this stuff down, and he referred to McConnell in his journal as a behavior modification researcher. He knew exactly who he was targeting and exactly why. After many years of just mailing bombs and hurting people, the bombing campaign turned lethal on December 11th of 1985. Hugh Scruton owned a computer rental store in Sacramento called Rentec. He was 38 years old and walked out the back door of his shop, saw what looked like a piece of road debris in the parking lot, and picked it up. It was a bomb that was loaded with nails and splinters. It went off and killed him instantly, and Ted Kaczynski was now a murderer. In February of 1987, the owner of a computer store in Salt Lake City named Gary Wright noticed a piece of wood with nails in it near his employee's car, and when he moved it, it exploded and 200 pieces of shrapnel went through his body. But just moments before this happened, an employee inside the store looked out the back window and saw a man who looked like this. The classic Unabomber sketch. A man in a hoodie and aviator sunglasses in the parking lot. That description became the classic sketch. If you've ever seen the Unabomber image, the hooded figure with the dark glasses, it came from that one witness at that store on that day. And insanely, this would be the only physical description the FBI had for almost a decade of the Unabomber. So after the event at the Utah computer store, there was a 6-year gap from 1987 to 1993. There was nothing. It was all silence. Ted was on a bit of a hiatus, but when he came back with 2 bombs in 2 days. The first was on June 22nd, 1993. A geneticist named Charles Epstein opened a padded envelope in the kitchen of his home in Tiburon, California. The explosion destroyed 3 fingers on his right hand, fractured his arm, and caused abdominal injuries and partial hearing loss. His wife was in the next room. And just to be very clear, Charles Epstein was not related to Jeffrey Epstein. Okay. Ted targeted Charles Epstein because he was the editor of the American Journal of Human Genetics, and Ted saw genetics research as technology manipulating nature itself, even though Epstein's actual work was focused on understanding Down syndrome. 2 days later, on June 24th, came the bomb that opened this video. David Gelernter at Yale. The package on his desk, the explosion that took his hand, the blood pressure at 0. After the bombing, Ted wrote a letter to the New York Times under his group name FC, which stood for Freedom Club. In it, he addressed Gelernter directly, quote, "People with advanced degrees aren't as smart as they think they are. If you'd had any brains, you would have realized that there are a lot of people out there who resent bitterly the way techno nerds like you are changing the world, and you wouldn't have been dumb enough to open an unexpected package from an unknown source." So he mocked the guy that he had nearly killed for not seeing it coming, saying that he was dumber than he thought he was. On December 10th, 1994, an advertising executive named Thomas Mosser was killed by a package bomb at his home in North Caldwell, New Jersey. He was supposed to be picking out a Christmas tree with his family that day, but his wife found him dead. Ted later explained the killing in a letter. He said Mosser's firm, Burson Marsteller, had helped Exxon clean up its image after the Exxon Valdez oil spill, and that made them a legitimate target. There was, however, one problem with that reasoning. Ted got the information from an Earth First newsletter, and it was wrong. Mosser had no connection to the Exxon Valdez account. Thomas Mosser was killed because Ted Kaczynski read something in a newsletter that wasn't true, which is very, very tragic. The final and last Unabomber bomb came on April 24th, 1995, and was sent to Gilbert Murray, the president of the California Forestry Association, and specifically the timber industry's lobbying arm. A female employee at the office was having trouble opening a package. Murray offered to help. He took it into his office and opened it. All in all, Ted Kaczynski killed 3 people and injured 23, and there were 16 bombs over 17 years. This is not where the story ends, though, because you've probably seen this book. After the last bomb, Ted Kaczynski did something that nobody really expected. He wrote a letter to the New York Times under the name FC, or Freedom Club once again, and he made an offer. He said, "Publish my manifesto, all 35,000 words of it, and I will stop." That put the FBI, the Justice Department, and 2 of the biggest newspapers in America in an impossible position. Do you give a terrorist a platform because he's threatening to kill people if you don't? I mean, probably, right? That doesn't really seem as bad as the other terrorist negotiations. Attorney General at the time, Janet Reno, and FBI Director Louis Freeh both recommended publication. Their reasoning was twofold. 1, if they published it, the bombings would stop. 2, maybe someone out there would read it and recognize the writing. On September 19th, 1995, the Washington Post printed Industrial Society and Its Future as a full supplement. The New York Times split the cost, and a terrorist's 35,000-word manifesto was delivered to every doorstep in Washington, D.C., thanks to that publication. It's very complicated, to be honest, because most people heard manifesto and thought that this would be lunatic, incoherent ramblings that a dude scrawled in a cabin, but that is just not what it is. The first line reads, "The Industrial Revolution and its consequences have been a disaster for the human race." And from there, it lays out a 232-paragraph argument about what technology does to people. Not what it could do, not someday, but what it was already doing in 1995. Because before smartphones existed, before social media, before algorithms, before any of the things we now take for granted that are a part of every aspect of our lives. His central concept is something that he calls the power process. The idea for that is simple. Human beings need to set goals, struggle to achieve those goals, and actually succeed through their own effort at some point. That's how people find meaning in their lives. And Kaczynski's argument is that modern industrial society has systematically removed that struggle from daily life. You don't have to hunt for food, you just go to a grocery store. You don't have to build shelter, you just pay rent. You don't solve problems that actually threaten your survival. You solve problems your employer gives you so you can afford to keep existing inside of the system that they control. The Ponzi scheme run by satanic pedophiles, basically. He was kind of aware of that. He called these replacement goals surrogate activities: career climbing, consumerism, entertainment, addiction, things that feel like they matter in the moment but do not address any real, actual human need. He wrote about what he called over-socialization, or the idea that people get conditioned so deeply into society's rules that they feel genuine guilt and shame for even having thoughts that go against the norm. This was written in 1995, before cancel culture was even a thing that anybody thought would ever exist, before people were getting fired for tweets that they wrote 10 years ago. And then he wrote this: "The system does not and cannot exist to satisfy human needs. Instead, it is human behavior that has to be modified to fit the needs of the system." He's totally right. He predicted that technology would be introduced as optional and then completely restructure society so that living without it would become impossible. In 1995, you didn't need a smartphone to apply for a job. You didn't need an email address to talk to your doctor. You didn't need an internet connection to file your taxes, to access your bank account, or maintain basic relationships with people that you care about. Now you need all of that. To even get a job, you have to compete with AI resume scraping. It's insane. Not to mention Palantir or mass surveillance. He wrote about this for 2 decades before Edward Snowden proved it was happening. And now we have studies and money actually being put into proving that there is a genuine, real mental health crisis tied to technological dependency. In the year of our Lord, 2026, teen depression, anxiety, and suicide rates are at historic highs, and the research increasingly points at the same screens that we cannot put down if we want to fit into society. And then there's this, guys, this warning that technology would eventually, quote, acquire something approaching complete control over human behavior. Algorithms that decide what you see, what you think about, what you're angry about, what you buy, and most people don't even really understand or notice that that's happening. It's pretty scary, to be honest. Now, that being said, this was written in 1995, so there's clearly a lot is different than this, but on the whole, there's a stark amount of accuracy, but there is a ton wrong, okay? Or at least I hope it's wrong, okay? I really hope it's wrong. His thinking and the way that he looked at this was binary. It was just black or white. It's either technology or freedom. There is no middle ground. And it seems like, I mean, he dismissed any possibility that societies could self-correct, that regulation could work against technology, or that people could push back and still keep the things that technology does well. He had a very romantic, primitive view of all of this stuff. Go back to the land, live like it's the 1700s, which sounds pretty cool until, you know, you have to start getting rid of like modern medicine and things like that. So absolutely a lot of accuracy, but also a bleak way to look at things, an extremist way to look at things, which nobody's going to argue against that. It is an extremist way to look at things, but the way that extremists look at things allows you to look at things differently if you look at them, I think. He did a really good job of pointing out the issue, but offering no viable alternative. He could diagnose the disease with a pretty unsettling accuracy, but he had no prescription. His prescription was to just mail bombs to people, which is not a realistic, moral solution. Because you can write the most brilliant critique of modern civilization that's ever been put on paper, but the moment that you mail bombs that kill people and maim over 20, you kind of forfeit your right to be taken seriously at a grand scale, because people don't really like murdering other people. That's kind of like a whole thing, Most people, at least. That is the trap, the classic Ted Kaczynski conundrum. The diagnosis is partially right. Some of it is prescient, but the violence makes it almost impossible to engage with, all right? What's very interesting is that there are people in the techno-dork world that actually understood this to a level in which I will never be able to pretend to understand. Bill Joy co-founded Sun Microsystems, a company that you have objectively heard about. Either that or you've used something. You've used something that's touched something of theirs, for sure. One of the most important technology companies of the 1990s. In April 2000, he published an essay in Wired magazine called Why the Future Doesn't Need Us. And in it, he acknowledged that Kaczynski was, in his words, criminally insane, but he also admitted he saw some merit in the technological warnings. One of the architects of the internet age read the Unabomber's Manifesto and said, yes, some of this is correct. Now that's some nuance, guys. I like that. That's cool. We need more people like that. Bill Joy, or whatever his name was. Forgot already. Now, Ted Kaczynski's still in the wild, all right? He releases his manifesto officially. The whole government publishes it. Everybody's reading it, talking about it. So the gambit worked on both sides. Ted K stopped bombing, and people took some level of, granular truth from the manifesto. But somewhere in Schenectady, New York, a man named David Kaczynski picked up the Washington Post and started reading his own brother's manifesto. He didn't realize what he was reading at first. Certain phrases jumped off of the page, things that sounded exactly like Ted, themes he'd heard his brother talk about for years. And then one phrase stopped him cold. You can't eat your cake and have it too. Most people say it the other way around. You can't have your cake and eat it too, but the Kaczynski family always said it Ted's way. Their mother insisted that that was the correct phrasing. So David would later describe waking up some mornings convinced it couldn't be his brother, and other mornings waking up and knowing the truth was staring him directly in the face. For weeks, David oscillated between denial and certainty. So David hired a private investigator named Susan Swanson out of Chicago to quietly look into Ted's activities. Then he hired a Washington, D.C. attorney named Tony Bisceglie to organize everything and make contact with the FBI. They found a bunch, they organized it, they gave it to the federal authorities. He was told that the death penalty would not be on the table, and that turned out not to be true. Attorney General Janet Reno pushed for the death penalty anyway, and David Kaczynski had turned in his brother to save lives, and now the government was trying to take his brother's life with the information that David had given them. At the FBI, a profiler named James Fitzgerald did something that had never been done in a case this big. He took the manifesto and compared it word for word and phrase by phrase against old family letters that David had provided, letters that Ted had written years earlier. Using forensic linguistics, the idea that every person has a unique way of writing and patterns of grammar, word choice, sentence structure, all as a distinctive fingerprint of sorts, Fitzgerald's analysis concluded that the manifesto's author and the letter writer were almost certainly the same person. And that analysis became the basis for a search warrant, and on April 3rd, 1996, FBI agents arrived at a 10 by 12-foot cabin outside Lincoln, Montana. Ted Kaczynski answered the door, and inside the cabin, agents found a live bomb ready to be mailed. They found an original copy of the manifesto, and they found 40,000 pages of handwritten journals documenting basically everything. His daily life, his philosophy, his bomb-making experiments, and detailed accounts of every attack. He had logged it all. 17 years of terror logged by his own handwriting in a cabin smaller than most people's bedrooms. On January 22nd, 1998, Ted Kaczynski pleaded guilty to all federal charges in a Sacramento courtroom. The deal was life without parole in exchange for no death penalty, with 4 consecutive life sentences plus 30 years. $15 million in restitution that he would never obviously pay because he's a dirt guy. He was sent to ADX Florence, the federal supermax in Colorado, where he'd spend the next 23 years in a 7 by 12-foot cell, slightly smaller than the cabin that he built for himself. After the arrest, David Kaczynski set up the Unabomber Survivors Fund, where he took $630,000 of what was left of the reward money after legal fees and taxes and donated every cent to all the victims. He wrote letters, made phone calls, met with survivors in person, and apologized to every single one of them for what his brother had done. Ted never apologized to anyone ever, not one time, not to the families of the 3 people he killed, not to the 23 he injured, not to his own brother who gave up everything to stop him. David heard later, third hand through an attorney, that when Ted was told it was his brother who turned him in, he wouldn't believe it at first. He said, quote, "No, David loves me. He would never do such a thing. But alas, David does not like you very much," or at least he's got morals, it seems like. He's got morals. That's the main difference. Ted Kaczynski spent the rest of his life in prison, and in 2021, he was diagnosed with late-stage rectal cancer and was transferred to a federal medical center in Butner, North Carolina, where he underwent chemotherapy for about a year and a half before stopping treatment in early 2023. And a month before his death, staff noted he was depressed. He was sent for psychiatric evaluation, and on June 10th, 2023, at 12 in the morning, Ted Kaczynski was found hanging from a handicap rail in his cell with a shoelace tied around his neck. He was 81 years old. The boy who entered Harvard at 16, the subject codenamed Lawful, the youngest professor Berkeley ever hired, the man who lived in a 10 by 12 cabin and mailed bombs for 17 years, murdered 3 people, and maimed over 20. Dead by his own hand in a room not much different from where he started. Now, obviously, I have to talk about the Epstein connection. One of the guys who got blown up by Ted Kaczynski and is also implicated in the, well, not implicated in a really illegal sense, but rather talking about, he is implicated in the Epstein files, okay? David Gilernter. If you've been watching this video, you know that guy. This David is the Yale computer science professor who opened a package on June 24th, 1993 and lost his own right hand. So why was Ted Kaczynski interested in David. In 1991, 2 years before the bombing, Gelernter published a book called Mirror Worlds. And that book essentially predicted the World Wide Web before most people had ever heard of the internet. He was one of the people building the future that Ted Kaczynski was trying to stop. David's name appears in 563 entries in the DOJ's Epstein document library. They were somewhat close, it seems. How close were they? Well, in December of 2009, a literary agent named John Brockman, who ran something called the Edge Foundation, forwarded an email from Gelernter to Epstein. Brockman was a connector. He made introductions between wealthy people and academics. He's the same person who introduced Epstein to scientists at MIT. Gelernter described Epstein as, quote, a sort of brooding, mystical appearance, and said he was willing to talk to him. So they started emailing each other, and they kept emailing each other for 6 years. This is after Jeffrey Epstein's conviction, sweetheart deal. They talked between 2009 to 2015. He was a registered sex offender at this time and pleaded guilty in 2008. All right, guys. That's before the correspondence began, so no excuses, Gelernter. The big email is that in October 2011, Gelernter sent Epstein an email recommending a Yale student for what he described as a job at Epstein's firm. And this is the email. He's recommending her for a job and describing a student's appearance to a convicted sex offender. So pretty 3 years after a conviction, by the way, for soliciting a minor. Very, very classy, Gelernter, man. And this is Gelerter's excuse. He wrote to the dean of Yale's engineering school. His defense was, this one was obsessed with girls like every other unmarried billionaire in Manhattan. In fact, like every other heterosex male. And if I hadn't said what I did in that letter 10 odd years ago, he would certainly have called me and asked for a lot more aesthetic detail. And then he said, this is how men behave. What? Are you sure? He then said, I'm very glad I wrote the note. Wow, man, how's that right hand doing? On February 11th, 2006, Yale suspended him from teaching. Probably good. I'd watch him around, you know, girls, to be honest. It's not just him, though. It's how men behave. So anyways, Ted K is in the news because of Epstein, and it is worth learning about. All the stuff's worth looking into and learning about. In all honesty, guys, hopefully you all enjoyed. If you did, press the like button, and I'll see you in the next video.